I'm going to kick off the session here today with a brief overview of what the definition of a fen, how is it similar to and different from a bog, for example. Describe the highlights of a big fen inventory that Mark Luschke and I did back in the late 80s, early 90s, to kind of put things in perspective statewide. Then I'm going to jump over and talk about the Nepal fen in particular, one fen in particular, that will be the topic of the other two speakers speaking tonight. So let's get started with the fen. I'm sure a lot of you have been on fens, so I don't want to belabor this too much. You're probably familiar with the idea. Fens are similar to bogs. They're both peatlands. They have histosols, organic soil that have built up through centuries, millennia of slow decomposition of organic matter in wetland settings. There are some differences. Bogs are, by definition, according to the official scientific definition of a bog, is that they maintain their peat against decomposition by being wet due to precipitation. Rainfall, snowfall, high humidity are what keeps their peat from just simply being oxidized away. It's constantly saturated, and so can't decompose. Fens, on the other hand, are also peatland. They also have to maintain their peat in some way to keep it from decomposing and oxidizing away, but it's accomplished through groundwater flow. And so one of the reasons that you find true bogs, mainly in the northern part of the United States, for example, in our region, Minnesota, Wisconsin, is because you're far enough north. You got the precipitation is higher, the temperature is lower, humidity is higher, that peat can be maintained simply by the action of keeping it wet through rain and snow. Where we are at our latitude in Iowa, our climate is too warm and dry for that. If we depended upon rainfall to keep our fens hydrated, they would dry out and oxidize and kind of blow away. And so we rely upon groundwater to maintain our peatlands, which we call fens. So bogs are precipitation ambotrophic ecosystems. Fens are groundwater fed or mineral trophic systems. Okay, I'm going to jump into a slideshow here. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works, and do this. I have to click on, there it is. Okay, well, let me put things in perspective. Back in the late 80s, early 1990s, Mark Luschke and I, Mark's my co-worker with the DNR, co-botanist at the DNR, we had a great interest in tracking down where the fens in Iowa were located, because they have lots of rare plants. And as botanists, we found that very exciting, and lots of other people found it exciting as well. And so we started a project to try and track down some more fens. But the time we started, there were only 3 fens known. Silver Lake Fen up in the north, Dickinson County, another fen kind of basically across the street from it, called the Excelsior Fens, now known as Dugout Creek Wildlife Area, and the Brayton Horsley Fen over in Bremer County. Those are the 3 at least best known sites that we had. We also learned the association that fens had with pistosols that were mapped very conveniently in the soil surveys of Iowa, the county soil surveys, at least where there was a large enough occurrence of a peat soil or muck soil. The NRCS, at that time known as the Soil Conservation Service, had very thoughtfully mapped where these things were. So we undertook an effort to look up all the locations of all the organic soils in Iowa using the county soil surveys. We did summarize our, at the end of our, near the end of our effort, which was never truly came to a complete end, but we had the bulk of our work was done between 1985 and 1991. And in 1992, we did publish a paper, the Iowa Academy of Science, of Floristic Composition and Conservation Status of Fens in Iowa. And it kind of summarizes what we did. I'm going to jump to the next slide. Whoops, if I can find my button here. Here it goes. Here's where our survey took us. So you can see it's mostly in northern Iowa. The round dots were where we were guided by soil surveys, which is the bulk of what we did. But we also relied upon some expert guidance from people who knew stuff in those counties, and those what the triangles are. And you can see that there's a lot of things in northern Iowa, but there's with this smattering of things clear down into Louisa County, for example. Some of the general patterns of the fens we knew of mostly had occurred. Traditionally, that the concept of a fen was that it occurred along at the western edge of the Des Moines lobe, over here where there is the edge of the Des Moines Glacier. Kind of a surprise we had was that we found a terrific number of fens over here on the Iowan surface, far more than we expected. And they actually outnumber the fens that are in the traditional fen country that we used to think of as being Northwest Iowa. Okay, I'm going to go through a quick summary of what we found on these. I'm going to round off these to very round numbers. We didn't have things ending in double zeros all the time, but I'm going to round off to the nearest set of zeros just to make the story go a little quicker. Through the help of the soil survey, we identified about 1,000 potential sites. Yes, 1,000 sites scattered across basically the north half of Iowa. From the soil survey, the soil survey had photos in it that were several years old, and it's very hard to see on such a broad scale. We need to get down to a much finer scale to see if something was interpreted as being present or absent. When we ordered the aerial photographs to make that determination, and back in the day, that just shows you just how much technology has advanced in 30 years. Back in the day, we did this in the late 80s and early 90s. We had to right away first off, starting with the soil survey, we had to look on the soil map and take a colored pen and circle all the 621s and 221s and 21s and mucky seepy spots that were on the map by hand and draw a little mark out in the margin so we wouldn't lose track of it. And then we had to right away to the SCS, Soil Conservation Service, saying, please send us a square mile map of this section containing this potential fen. And then we'd wait a week, and that would come in, we'd look at it, and we could make a determination of where the fen should be from the soil map, try to find the same spot on the section map, try to make a determination was there or not. It turns out that of the 1,000 sites, we could toss out 600 of them right away. Many of those were obviously destroyed. They were crop fields. There's really nothing left to see on the aerial photograph. It also included a very large number of itsy bitsy tiny fragments that we wanted to visit all the fen candidates, but we had to make a decision. We weren't going to get to them all if we put this to our second priority category, these itsy bitsy tiny remnants that were visible on aerial photographs. We found about 100 that were actually not fens at all. And once we get out in the field, we found that the muck soils had been mapped on a variety of topographic sites, and some of them really didn't have the correct hydrology to be a fen of being spring fed. So we lost about 100 sites simply because they were a sedge meadow or a wet prairie, something else of interest in another topic, but they weren't fens that we were looking for. That left about 300 sites for us to field check. And we kind of naively thought that we could get this done in about 1 or 2 field seasons. And at the end of 5 field seasons, we still had not completed all the tasks. We got to quite a few of them. We did find, to our great surprise, that there were about 200 sites, including degraded ones, that could be termed fens. They had the proper soils, they had the proper hydrology, they had the proper plants. About 200 sites. What a cry from the original 3 that motivated us to look for them in the first place. Now, of course, I need to quickly qualify that a lot of these were highly degraded, very small, partially tiled, overgrazed, next to crop fields, have had a weed invasion problem, all manner of issues. But there are also quite a few really nice ones. So the 200 is kind of a composite of all those qualities. We found of those 200, we found 100 of them that actually had a rare plant species on them. Something on our endangered, threatened, or special concern plant list, of which there were about 25 species that we knew were fen indicators. About 100 of those sites actually had one or more fen species on them. And again, some of them occurred just as ironically, just a little bitty, a small population on a highly degraded site. I remember Mark and I came across some that were just might have one plant, 1 or 2 stems of one rare species that was hanging on to the edge of a drainage ditch, looking deep into the ditch, but there they were nonetheless. Get it down to if you start applying quality considerations, depending on how strict or liberal your definition of quality is, there's about 25 really high quality sites. If your threshold is a little bit lower, you might say 50. If your threshold is very high, you might say about 10. Tonight, we're going to be talking about one particular fen called the Nepal fen, after the surname of the current landowner. And where does it fit in all this? Well, it fits the yellow arrow points up. We considered it at the time of our survey to be one of the 600 destroyed or tiny fragments. And so we didn't actually spend any time on this site. It was in our second priority, or actually for a long time, we thought it was completely gone. As you'll see, that's not quite true. So I'm going to jump out of my this slideshow, if I can remember how to do that now. And start sharing my screen again. And this time I'm going to go to my Excel sheet. Now, can anybody see that? Anybody not see that? I got an Excel spreadsheet up.
We can see the Excel sheet. If you want to, on like the lower right, you can zoom, which might make it a little bigger.
Oh, okay. I will try that. Whoops.
Which might, oh, that might be too big.
That's right. That's
okay.
Usually one I need to see anyway. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for that confirmation. Well, let's look at now the Nepal fen. You'll see lots of pictures later, so I'm not going to refrain from showing pretty pictures of plants and landscapes. They're all just in order to get through this more quickly. But I want to point out that this Nepal fen is actually a very famous site, or was a very famous site historically. When I went through, Mark and I have maintain a database of rare plants that we find. And when I started looking for the rare plants that botanists before us had found on the Nepal fen, or what was called the Esterville fen, or the Big Fen, or the Big Esterville fen, various names that people applied to it back then, we found a whole bunch of fairly famous botanists who had been there. First, let's start off with the year. The earliest collection we had that we discovered during our herbarium search was 1925 by B.O. Walden. B.O. Walden was an author of the Flora of Emmett County and a very productive botanist back in the early 1900s. I'm going to skim on down to you can see the dates here on the left: 1925, 2031, 34, 39, 43, 48. I'm kind of skipping over 53, 73, 1990. The record kind of comes to an end, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. But we got about a 65-year history of this when we started to look at the Nepal fen as a possible restoration site. Some of the famous people, I mentioned B.O. Walden already. R.J. Craddy collected here at this very site. 1925, chances are he was out with Walden at the time. Craddy was a very productive botanist, spent most of the time in Emmett County. He was also the curator of the Ada Hayden Herbarium, at least what became known as the Ada Hayden Herbarium, the Iowa State College Herbarium back then. Ada Hayden was visited this site, 1925, and others. You see, Walden did a lot more collecting all the way up through, early 1930s here. There's Ada Hayden, Walden went out together at the same time. More Ada Hayden records up to 1934. Jess Fultz, who was a botanist mostly known for his work in Southeast Iowa. David Savage was a self-trained botanist from Southeast Iowa who made it a kind of a personal mission to start to document the flora of Iowa. He had a personal project called the Flora of Iowa Project, completely self-funded. He was completely self-taught. He is not a professional botanist. He was a farmer by background, but became a very prolific collector of Iowa flora. You see, Savage and Walden went out together, and Walden and Hayden went out together. 1948, Martin Grant shows up for the first time. He was a very famous botanist at the University of Northern Iowa, or Iowa State Teachers College at the time. A very productive botanist, wrote lots of flora and articles about the flora of Iowa. Drexler, who was the head of the Coe College Herbarium, the botany department, the Coe College Herbarium is now named the Drexler Herbarium. Another famous name, Robert Thorne, incredibly productive botanist who just had commissioned a whole bunch of graduate students in the 1950s and 60s to systematically cover the entire state of Iowa landform by landform, documenting the flora of natural areas and other areas within those landforms. One of his most recent students now passed away, of course, Larry Eilers, who wrote the Flora of Iowa for us. Dean Rosa, also a co-author of the Flora of Iowa and a state ecologist prior to my position. And finally, we have coming in the 1990s, Mark Luschke and Bob Moats. Bob Moats was a conservation officer in Emmett County who just dedicated himself when he wasn't chasing bad guys around the countryside to chasing down rare plants. And he was a great source of information to Mark and me. And Mark spent a lot of time with Bob and also on his own doing inventories in this area. And Mark is a prolific collector of rare plants. Well, what are some of those plants? It turns out there's just going by the rare ones. Now, I'm going to go through only the ones that we track as rare species, threatened, endangered, or special concern. Now, if I were to make a list of all the species that these people collected, of course, it'd be much larger. You'd include cattails and bulrushes and all the rest. But we're just going to just, there was about 12 fen species that they collected repeatedly. I'm going to draw your attention to just a few of them for time's sake. Look at Spiranthes romanzophiana here. This is a very rare plant in the ladies' tresses. The hooded ladies' tresses is called. Today, it's known from one and only one site in the entire state of Iowa, and that's Silver Lake Fen State Preserve. This was the second site, and it was present at that time. In fact, it was collected in 1925 by Craddy, 1925 by Walden, again in 25 in Walden, 26 by Walden. David Savage collected it in 1948, Drexler, 1950. And forgot to highlight, there's one more. Here's, I meant to turn that red. Robert Thorne collected it in 1953. Their comments are also really interesting to read. For the first many decades, it was a happy place to be a botanist. There were lots of rare plants to be found, lots of wetland plants in general to be found, lots of native prairies nearby, lots of other botanists to go botanize with. It was a great place to be a botanist. And it was like that way for many years. You can see the kind of the things they wrote about: hilltop bog, bogs in Emmett County, in wet bog, fen bog, bog near Westerville, bog northwest of Wester, hanging bog with these rare plants, bog 4 miles north of Westerville, blah, 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 large fen, Emmett County, on hummocks around Fen or a Hillswide Spring, hanging bog, upland calcareous bog, large North Westerville fen. Drexler came up with a very colorful name called the Big Esterville fen. To me, that's a good name for it to keep in mind. Now here in red, when things turn tragic, Robert Thorne, 1953, began to record large fen since drained along Des Moines River. Wet marl, big fen since drained. Fen along Des Moines River, fen recently tiled and already desiccated to a large degree. Marl fen drained, since drained. It's 1953. Something bad happened to this fen, and you'll see more in detail. It was ditched and tiled. The ditches that were dug were truly enormous. They must have used one of these big drag lines to carve such enormous ditches on this big fen. I should mention too, this was an enormous fen by today's standards. It's probably something on the order of 80 to 100 acres, straddling more than multiple ownerships. Dean Rosa came in 1973, also know the fen, drained fen near Des Moines River, but there were some remnants of rare plants growing. Drained fen and pasture, more Dean Rosa. When Mark Lushke and Bob Most visited, they called it a disturbed calcareous fen remnant. So they did find a remnant. Now that was actually news to me at the time. I thought it was all gone. At least infrequent in a disturbed calcareous fen. Most of it was tiled years ago, harking back to the 50s. Now we're in the 1990s. And let's go back to the date column real quickly. If you go down the date column from the top, initially there's only a gap between visits of 1, 2, or maybe 5 years at the most before it was visited again by the same person or someone else. All through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s that went on, only a gap of 1 to a few years. After Robert Thorne discovered that it was tiled and drained and only it seemed to be destroyed, 1953, he did the last set of collecting, 1953. The next time it was visited, it was 20 years later by Dean Rosa. 20 years went by because people were under the impression it was gone. There was nothing left. Fortunately, that wasn't 100% true. And it's one of the reasons we're here today, having this discussion. And then again, about another 17 years went by between the time that Dean went and the time that Mark and Bob visited. So it got the level of attention dropped way off because it had been so, had a very tragic turn to its history, and people regarded it as completely gone. Well, I'm going to stop here and turn it over to John Paulin to pick up the next part of the story, which I think you'll find very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, John Pearson. It's really neat to get that background information and the history of it all and all those cool botanists from back in the day. That's super neat.
It was great just to walk in there, literally walk in their footprints. It was a real trip.
Myself, I'm John Paul, and I'm the Wetland Restoration and Management Specialist for the Iowa Natural Resource Conservation Service on the easement programs team out of Des Moines. And while I'm one face of NRCS here, I would say that I'm probably the least qualified of all the people that worked on it to talk about this project, and a lot of credit goes out to our field staff, the easement specialists that worked on enrolling this easement that we'll talk about here in a minute, Brenda Tenold-Moritz, the work of former state biologist Jennifer Anderson Cruz, and our engineering field staff that overcame a lot of hurdles to bring this through to fruition. So with that, I'll see if I can't get this presentation up and rolling. And I'll give you a little bit of an introduction into NRCS conservation easements and what those entail, because I'm going to venture a guess that while a lot of you are well versed in the botany world, you might not be as well versed in the opportunities that are out there for conservation easements. So let's get rolling. So a little brief history on conservation easements in Iowa. So Iowa was one of the first 10 states in the union to pilot what was to become the Wetland Reserve Program back in 1992. So following the 1985 Farm Bill and the provisions, the conservation provisions that brought about in the early 1990s, there became an interest in trying to work to reverse the trend of wetland conversion that happened with the boom in row crop agriculture that we saw in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, et cetera. And as a result of that, the conservation easements programs came to be under then the Soil Conservation Service and later the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So Iowa has a history, almost a 3-decade-long history now of conservation easement programs. If you look at the map in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, this kind of shows the distribution of easements that we have across the state. Lower workload counties are in the lighter colors, heavier workload counties are in the darker colors. So in total, as of the end of fiscal year 21, we have just under 1,700 conservation easements totaling just over 195,000 acres across the state of Iowa. So 87 of the 99 counties in the state have conservation easements that are administered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. A little bit of definition and history of what conservation easements are and how they came to be. Going back to the Wetland Reserve Program back in the early 90s, the main priority under the WRP, as some of you might be familiar with it being called, main priorities revolved around habitat for migratory birds and wetland dependent species. Over the course of time, offshoots of different conservation programs started to pop up. Some were directed at the protection of timber and forest lands under the Healthy Forest Reserve Program. Another was targeted at protecting agricultural lands from development. The first iteration of that being the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program, later to become Agricultural Conservation Easement, Agricultural Land Easement Program. And a third one of those specifically directed towards the southern couple of tiers of counties in the state, being the Grassland Reserve Program, preserving those working lands for grazing and other similar uses. To streamline things, with the advent of the 2014 Farm Bill, all of the easement programs were brought under the umbrella of one program called the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And under that, there's two facets. The first of those is the agricultural land easements. And you'll see down there in the lower left, agricultural land easements, again, are those that are protecting working lands from development. Tonight, we're going to focus on the second, that's the wetland reserve easements. Again, the priority here is for the protection and restoration of former and degraded wetlands. So as you can imagine, as all of those individual programs were brought under the umbrella of ACEP, priorities were expanded and brought new and different priorities to add to the migratory bird purposes and wetland dependent species purposes. So we started to get priorities for water quality and water quantity, protection of open space. One of the more recent ones is carbon sequestration. And then one that gets tapped into now and then is for educational and scientific scholarship purposes. So again, as you can see, we have in the upper right-hand corner of your page, there's another map. Those are showing the point locations of individual easements across the state. So you're going to see significant clusters around all of the major river systems across the state. And then the other main area focus that we have, of course, is in the Prairie Pothole region up there in the Iowa Great Lakes, north central Iowa and the east central Iowa. So pretty well distributed across the state.
Distributed.
So I'm sure there's a question out there as to how did this particular project come to be, and how did the Nepal property come to be a conservation easement? So we're going to begin up here in the upper left-hand corner of the page. All of these processes start with a basic conservation program application that a landowner can come into any NRCS field office, and we have a field office in each of the 99 counties across the state, can come into the office and sign up for any federally assisted program. As you'll see here in the lower portion of the application page with a couple of colored boxes, the landowner has checked the box that he wishes to apply for the agricultural conservation easement program, wetland reserve easements. The landowner provides a basic bit of information about the property, about their ownership of the property, et cetera. And at that point, they're eligible for any of the NRCS programs that are out there. So let's talk specifically about this wetland reserve easement program and how we move from this application and get it through to the restoration that I'll talk about here in a second. So once we have a viable application, we have to look at both the eligibility of the landowner and the eligibility of the land. From the landowner perspective, the landowner has to be registered with the Farm Service Agency as a producer. They have to be both wetland compliant and highly erodible land compliant on any land that they have for production. They have to have owned the land for 24 consecutive months. They have to have clear title to the land in order for it to be eligible. And the final piece of the puzzle would be the eligibility of the land piece itself. And what we look at there is primarily, has it been altered and is it restorable? So in this case, as you'll see here in a few minutes, this property was significantly altered by man, and we did have some potential to restore it as well. So moving forward with an eligible application and an eligible landowner, we move into ranking. So up here in the upper center part of the page is a small snippet of our ranking. And fortunately for this site, over the course of any given fiscal year, we receive probably between 50 and 125 applications for conservation easements across the state. Those are broken out by a couple of different categories. We break them out by pothole or depressional wetlands, riverine wetlands, and fortunately for this site, fen and remnant sites, prairie remnant sites. And we have a separate category for the Missouri River Valley as well. So basically what this boils down to is that because this site exhibited those fen characteristics that John was mentioning, it's able to compete in a separate category only against other fen and remnant sites, which significantly limits the amount of competition it has and increases the potential for enrollment. So what do we look at once we have an application and we have a ranking for the site to filter it out to see if we're going to fund it? Well, the main thing comes back to the Floristic Quality Index. And fortunately, because of John and Mark Lushke's involvement on the site and the inventories that they had done, they had established here in the center of the page that the total Floristic Quality Index of the site came in at a 30.8. If I could zoom in on this ranking form up here in the top center, this box right here contains about 30% of the points in the ranking. And that is directly reflective upon what the Floristic Quality Index is of the site. And in order to score the highest amount of points in this category, the FQI had to have been greater than 30. So at that point, we check that box, that site gets the maximum amount of points, and it's almost a shoo-in for funding. So pretty much advancing through the process, we knew that this site ranked well. We knew that it was likely to be funded. We made the selection for it to be funded, interacted with the landowner, Mr. Nepal, and his family decided that they were interested in proceeding with the program. And so at this point, we started the process of enrollment. So from the process of enrollment, we're going to take a permanent conservation easement on this property. So I'm sure many of you are wondering about compensation for enrolling it into a permanent conservation easement. So down here in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, is a map of what we call the geographic area rate cap. So these are basically an assessment of the fair market value of lands within a given region. We do an annual survey of recent sales and determine the valuations for three basic land use categories. We look at cropland, we look at timber and forested lands, and we look at pasture grasslands. And each one of those three land uses has a different valuation attached to it. When it comes time to making an actual monetary offer in exchange for the conservation easement, to really simplify things, when it comes right down to it, the landowner is slated to receive up to about 80%, 85%, excuse me, of the fair market value of the property in exchange for that conservation easement. In the end, again, Mr. Neppel's family was accepting of the offer we made on the property, so we moved into putting forth and enacting the easement deed on the property. So basically here in the lower right-hand corner of your screen is the first page of the warranty easement deed that goes along with these conservation easements, establishing that the United States is acquiring the rights to the property for the purposes and intent of restoring wetlands primarily on said property. But basically the deed lays out all the terms and conditions under which the land will be basically governed from this point forward. I should add that here in Iowa, we typically have two enrollment options. You can either do a 30-year easement or you can do a permanent easement. Some states limit permanent to 99 years, but the Iowa Code defines perpetual easement in Iowa as being basically forever. So the key thing to remember here is that this easement goes with the land. It survives sale. So regardless of whether the property is sold, the easement stays on it in perpetuity. A couple of questions that we typically get when it comes to what does the landowner retain when they put land into an NRCS conservation easement? There's basically a couple main things. First thing, as I said, is that the landowner retains the right to sell the property. Though we have purchased 85% of the value, the fair market value of the property, the landowner retains that 15%, and that 15% basically amounts to the recreational value of the property. So hunting, fishing, bird watching, basically the low impact recreational uses of said property. Another question we commonly get is, if I put my land in a conservation easement, do I have to allow the public on to it? And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. The landowner retains the right to control trespass and access to the easement, and therefore it is not open to the public once it goes into the conservation easement. The other thing that the landowner retains is the right to any subsurface resources that might be present on the property, provided those resources can be accessed without causing detriment to the easement itself and the purposes for which it was taken. So that's a very quick and very dirty crash course into how a conservation easement, in this case the Neppel easement, comes to play. Once we've got that warranty easement deed in place, all of the closing costs, all of the abstracting, all of the survey costs, all those are covered by the U.S. government as part of the acquisition of the easement, so the landowner doesn't have to worry about any of those items. And then also up here in the upper right-hand corner, once all that has come to fruition and we've closed the easement, all of the restoration costs for a permanent easement are covered as part of the arrangement with NRCS as well. So let's take a look at this restoration in particular here on the Neppel Fen. I'm going to come right out and say nobody had all of the answers to how to best restore a fen. It's really, fen restoration is not a well covered topic in both published literature and in practice. And as a result, we kind of admitted up front that we didn't have all of the answers. And so we decided to take a collaborative approach. And fortunately, we were blessed right off the bat by involving as many agencies and outside entities as we could and thus came to be my relationship with my two cohorts on this presentation tonight. And I truly feel blessed by not only their involvement, but also the multipliers that they have brought to the table as well. This project would not have ever come close to being where we are today were it not for the efforts of John and Rebecca and their respective allies across the way. So that being said, our first approach to restoration on this easement took a page out of medical practice, and our first idea was to do no harm. As John indicated, by the studies that were done in the 1990s and some of the surveys that he and Mark Luschke did later on, there was some indicators that we had some remnant communities, some remnant Fen community left on this site. So we didn't want to do anything to impact those. We tried to take a very measured approach to restoration. So let's look at this in, through time, through these aerial photographies to kind of give you an idea of what happened and where we got to restoration. So up here in the upper left-hand corner of your screen is an aerial photo from the 1930s. This would have been pre-alteration. The thing I want to point out to you here that in spite of this being in black and white, I want you to note this very dark gray, kind of marly looking area here that makes up the vast majority of the easement area. And I'll note that the easement itself is outlined here in light green. That darker colored area represents those muck soils that John was referencing earlier. This is blue earth, silty, mucky, silty loam. There's a mouthful there. But that one soil type primarily makes up the entirety of the easement area. And you're going to see that kind of evolve as we look through these different photos. Moving over here to the next photo to your right, this is the photo from the 1960s. As you can see, these areas highlighted in yellow, those two surface ditches were cut into the property in an effort to disable that saturated soil that made that fen condition possible. So basically these ditches were cut across the grain of the fen area, bringing those saturated soils, all that hydrology to the surface, putting it in the ditch, and then eventually draining it to the Des Moines River over here to the east. Again, there's one ditch that was cut here to the north and one to the south. And as you can see, it basically doubly bisected that property. So again, that occurred, as John noted in his timeline, in the early 1950s, and the 1960s photo here captures that pretty well. Moving over here to the right, this is color infrared photography from the 1980s, and the four arrows here indicate that that drainage that was put in place in the 50s enabled a couple of decades worth of row crop production on the easement. So what you see here basically shown in black would be the areas that have been tilled up and ready for crop production in the 1980s. I used color infrared photography on the last two of these images for a couple of reasons. These areas that are highlighted in blue here, again, we're in the 1980s. There's still crop production taking place on the easement, or on what was to become the easement. But there's a couple of areas here on this photo that show up vastly different and not tilled up, mind you, in the 1980s photo. So looking at these two areas, keep this in mind as we move forward here to the 2011 photograph here on the right. For what it's worth, for those of you that might not be familiar with color infrared photography interpretation, the shades of red here are basically the reflection of green. Plants are reflecting red light and absorbing the green light. And as a result, when we look at this photo from 2011, you see a couple of different shades of red here. I want you to point out these areas that are kind of pinkish magenta colored in various areas here. The way that's reflecting, this photo was taken in early August, and that kind of pinkish / magenta color is indicative of vegetation that is senesced or dying or not actively growing at the time the photo was taken. So in early August, that would lead us to believe that we're probably dealing with cool season, and in likely in this case in cool season grasses. So we have encroachment of brome from the former crop fields and the CRP And the areas that are wetter along the ditch edges, that's likely encroachment by reed canary grass. So what's this telling us? When you look over here on the right, again, in these blue areas that I've highlighted, carrying over from the 1980s photograph, you see hints of richer, deeper red, almost a brick red in those areas. So again, this photo taken in August, we have brick red here that's indicative of growing vegetation. You can see it over here in the tree canopy as well. So if we're growing in August, that would be probably warm season. And thinking about warm season, we're thinking probably native grasses and forbs and high potential for that. And we also noticed that the ground cover is coming up a little bit different color too, probably because of the hydrology. So there's a couple of indicators here that, again, these areas have carried through time. Those were our first thoughts, that maybe we have some remnants that we shouldn't touch. And we also, at the same time, have indications that there are areas that are highly disturbed in and around the ditches. In this area, I should note too, this trapezoidal feature here in the middle was a food plot. We also knew that we had disturbed areas that we would focus our restoration on, knowing that we wouldn't be doing much harm in those locations and probably yielding the best bang for our buck in terms of restoration. So based upon that analysis, we were able to pretty quickly identify our restoration priorities. So on the engineering plan that you see a copy of here on the right-hand side of the screen, you're going to see a couple of different things noted. So these blue lines indicate subsurface drainage. So in addition to the ditches marked out here in red, we also had concrete, plastic, and clay tile remnants, laterals coming off of those that were also draining and causing changes to the hydrology of the surrounding landscape here. So we wanted to disable those. Second priority here, we knew that those surface ditches were the primary driver to the drainage of what was the former fen area. So we wanted to fill those. As we showed from those color infrared photos, the third thing we wanted to do was strip those areas that have been dominated by reed canary grass and brome, get that vegetation off of there. And then also, if we needed additional borrow to help fill in those ditch areas, because as you know, those organic soils, as they are exposed, as the hydrology goes away, they start to oxidize and basically slough and disappear. We knew we were going to have to fill those in, and we were going to need some borrow to do so. So we targeted those areas that have been previously disturbed to strip off and provide those areas to fill in the ditches. The final piece that we really wanted to do was facilitate the resaturation of this fen. So as John noted, fens in Iowa and the fen condition in general is the hydrology is sourced from the groundwater, so from bottom up. So what do we do to resaturate those soils? So disabling drainage, one, filling in the ditches, two, and then the third thing, to really try and cut off. So basically the ditches and the drains served to collect the hydrology and carry it downstream and eventually drain it to the Des Moines River. So we wanted to cut off that downstream movement of water and create a lateral flow resaturation within the groundwater surface profile. So in order to do that, we were planned to install a series of sheet pile weirs in each one of those ditches to again cut off what was perpendicular to the flow path of those ditches and ensure that that went down into the soil profile to again get that water out and into the surrounding soils. So a couple of quick pictures here as to how we went about this. So again, restoration priorities, disable the subsurface drainage. So we did tile investigation with an excavator, basically 50-foot excavations, about 6 foot deep, to identify these subsurface drain tiles that were present. Once we located those, they were allowed to drain off. And once they were drained off, a commercial cap was placed on the tile and concrete placed on top of it to ensure that those tiles are no longer functional. Quick caveat here, all of the tiles that we capped and plugged, we made sure first that there wasn't drainage coming from adjacent properties that needed to be maintained. In our case, fortunately, all of those were confined within the easement area, so we could block and plug every one of those. So mission 1 accomplished. Step 2, fill those drainage ditches. Okay, here in the pictures, you can see the drainage ditches were stripped and prepped. Basically, that area between the 2 drainage ditches was stripped of vegetation. Any additional fill that we needed came from those areas. So we killed 2 birds with 1 stone there. And then in addition to the borrow areas that we had, when those ditches were dug, they basically just side cast all the material from the ditches and parked it alongside. So a lot of that material we could just push back in, refill those ditches. So we stripped those areas, got rid of the vegetation, were able to get our borrow. Everything was leveled off and graded. And again, the work area, we limited to those areas that were previously disturbed. For those of you that might not be familiar with sheet pile and what it involves, basically we had about 2 foot wide sheets of plate steel, corrugated plate steel. I believe they were 12 feet long. Those were put in place and they interlock. Here in the lower left, here you see basically a vibratory compactor set on top of that plate and vibrated it down into the soil the soil profile. And so basically we had 3 lines down the ditch perpendicular to the flow, cutting that off within the soil profile to ensure that that water then was working its way out into and saturating the adjacent soils. And then everything regraded down here in the lower right. You can see basically just the tops of the sheet pile there, and everything leveled off and regraded to what we could estimate was the original soil surface. So that pretty much was the extent of the physical restoration of the site. We elected not to do anything from a vegetative restoration standpoint and kind of took the approach of build it and they will come from vegetation, knowing that these native seed banks can be pretty resilient. And I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Rebecca, and Rebecca will show you what the findings that her staff at Lakeside were able to come up with in the year following restoration. And I think you'll like to see how things are coming along. So I'll turn it over to Rebecca at this point.
All right, thank you, John. Sarah, do you want to comment a little here? Nope.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I think
Fair enough.
I think you did a great job. And I, from a personal standpoint, I just really love the idea of easements. So the more conservation easements we can get out on the landscape, I'm all for that. All right, You should be good to go now.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, I'll introduce myself here too. My name's Rebecca Cowton. I know many of you on this Zoom. I don't know everyone, but I know a lot of you. My interest in Fens, as many of you know, goes back a very long way. A little bit of personal experience with my own family. And it's been a pleasure and a joy to be able to work on this project as part of my job. For the last couple of years, I have been the scientist in residence at Iowa Lakeside Lab on West Lake Okoboji in Northwest Iowa. I'm still I always tell people, I still get my mail in Cedar Falls. But my job during the summer months from about May till August is not only teaching a few classes, teaching prairie ecology, teaching intro to geographical information systems. So maps and data are kind of my thing. But I also, this year, we launched an introductory class on field research and inquiry, specializing in undergraduate research. And this particular project served as kind of a launch pad for that course, for the studies that students were doing throughout the summer, and really kind of solidified my role in this particular project, being able to have access to the site courtesy of the Nepal family, NRCS, and being able to travel out there with John Pearson from time to time has really opened up some amazing opportunities for some of our students and possibly some of yours or people you know, young people you know who may have an interest in this. So I kind of want to follow the John Pearson and John Paulin with what we've been up to and set the tone for hopefully an invitation for other young people to join us for similar work in the months ahead. But the driving force for this project, as far as how Lakeside Lab has been involved, really started with a visit in 2019 with John Pearson and the Prairie Ecology class. This is a shot I took of that drainage ditch on a day in November of 2019. It was a day very similar to today as far as weather goes. It was the last really non-snow-filled day in Northwest Iowa in 2019, and we were out there to capture some terrestrial LiDAR imagery that we had a small grant from Iowa Native Plant Society to do. So this was the ditch we were interested in as far as the rest of the Fen goes too. But the research questions that launched this project was looking at what will be or what can be the extent of Native reestablishment within the reconstructed area over time. So our goal here is to be able to monitor not only the immediate results, but because of our geographic convenience, we at Lakeside are able to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening on this site, which is really great. And then looking at the restored hydrology over time, did it work, right? Did plugging the tiles do the job? Did taking the drainage ditches out work as far as restoring what we can of this particular area? And then for both agencies and private landowners to say what management strategies are appropriate based on this type of restoration. Could this work elsewhere? Or is this really a very site-specific experiment? So to take you through where we have been, 2019 was my first step on this site. So as John was saying, the last people to set foot out there for the sake of scientific inquiry was in the 1990s. So it was very exciting to be able to be out there with John and to see the site, even though the drainage ditch both drainage ditches were still there. There was corn stubble on the ground when we were walking through the area. You could see, also the small dried up snail shells. So there's this weird postmodern yet primordial sense of what was there and what could be there early on when we were visiting the site in 2019. Spring and summer of 2020, we were doing some baseline data collection. That initial grant we got from Iowa Native Plant Society, we were out in November of 2019. And so we were trying to coordinate with the construction activities, making sure we weren't going to be in the way of any contractors and anything like that, but to be able to collect as much data as we could before the restoration happened, as well as immediately following. The construction activity was in August of 2020, and if any of you happen to remember the summer of 2020, things were kind of quiet. However, we were able to visit the site periodically, but we didn't have interns or students on campus at Lakeside, so everything was relatively virtual. A few of us were able to, kind of get up there and do some data collection as we could, but it was a challenging year for many reasons. But by fall and winter and into the summer, we were actually able to hit the ground running this past year. So to just walk you through some of the images of what we saw when we were out with John, the Prairie Ecology class that I teach at Lakeside Lab was able to include this as one of our field experiences. I have John come up for about a day and a half to join us to hit a few sites in Northwest Iowa, and he suggested this as a place. Wasn't on my radar, as the documentation shows, the literature shows, it wasn't on anyone's radar for about the last 30 some odd years. And so we visited this area and we saw what you would expect to see in many ways. We saw a lot of brome, we saw reed canary grass, we saw a giant drainage ditch, right, leading down to the Des Moines River. But we also saw at the bottom of that drainage ditch, sedges. and cattails and some of the plants that you would expect to see in a saturated wetland, possibly even a fen. And then you visited the remnant area portion of the area, the site in that northeast corner, and sure enough, you can jump on quaky ground in that area. You still have a bit of remnant fen community in this area, despite the fact that yes, it had been drained within an inch or two of its life. So we jumped out there. Again, thank you to Iowa Native Plant Society for supporting us to get some students from University of Iowa, and you can see Adam Skibby here with he's our GIS technician with the geography department. We lugged around a very heavy, very expensive piece of equipment to scan what we could of the site, as well as the CRP parcel to the south, mostly to experiment. This was an effort that using tools that were typically used indoors and in buildings. The last time this group had taken their tools on the road, they went to France to scan cathedrals, and they were working in a completely different domain. And here I'm saying, hey, it's 19 degrees outside. Let's go take some pictures and see what happens. So it was a little bit different of an experiment. But my objective was to see, can we use these tools in a different environment to capture a different type of data for a site like this? And given the dramatic appearance of these drainage ditches, to see their removal, I think is a measurable accomplishment. I said to John when we were standing at the top of that drainage ditch, you could tell whoever dug that took this very personally. They were doing everything they could to make sure the water was going to the river one way or another. But in 2020, when the construction was over and the contractors were gone, the sheet pile was in the ground, and people wondering, why is that sheet pile there? Well, if you're restoring hydrology in a place where there's very delicate soils, and if the water comes back at the rate that you think it's going to, it's probably going to wash out everything you've just put in place. So it was very good thinking on behalf of the engineers and designers of this project to do that. But we were out maybe a week or two after they had left the site, and you could already start to see water returning to those areas. And going back to John's spreadsheet from earlier tonight, that hillside spring that was mentioned, I think either by Thorne or others, more than likely was that area that was starting to rehydrate. So, the season ended last summer, the dark days of a pandemic and field work came to a close, and we came back in May. May 18th was the first full day of classes at Lakeside, and starting to take a look at the site. You'll notice this strip of vegetation in what's otherwise bare soil. That was the sedge mat that was at the bottom of that drainage ditch. John Pearson had requested when the ditch be removed, that sedge mat be relocated to an area that was going to rehydrate. Again, it's an experiment. We're here to see what happens. And the area that's rehydrating is surrounding that particular sedge mat. So we start to see the most hydrologic activity actually occurring we're facing kind of a northeast projection. And so just to the south of that sedge mat was where you really started to see a lot of the soil starting to hydrate, but then also to the north as well. You'll notice that there are some erosion control practices in place as well, because again, as that water started to return to the site after the tiles were plugged, that fragile soil was starting to move. And if you've ever set foot on a fen or any other kind of spring-fed wetland that has, the mucky, hummocky soils, you do see, sometimes surface water moving on top. And so while this was, I think kind of definitely a concern for the folks that were working on this project, I was kind of excited by it. But we were able to, it was fun to be able to collaborate with the folks at NRCS to say, well, let's try to control some of the erosion, stabilize that flow path, but still let that water move, because more than likely, and this is again just my my perspective, more than likely there probably was some water that was making its way to the river one way or another, whether the soils were saturated and gravity was taking it. But this gave us a chance again to experiment a little bit, and lo and behold, we had some creative folks at NRCS work with us to put in erosion control blanket to stabilize the channels that were forming, and then also put a series of sediment control logs. So as the soil was making its way down that channel, we were able to capture some of that and not just send it all to the bottom of the slope. And you'll see, again, this is the picture from earlier in the season. As we moved down that slope, the area was pretty well stabilized once the blankets were in place, which was good. And you'll notice we still didn't see a whole lot of vegetation. 2020 and 2021 also happened to be drought years. And in the work of seeing a fen be restored, and your goal is to keep weeds down, it's really really convenient to be able to do that in a drought. You can't always count on that, but in this case, it really worked to our advantage. That the hydrology was what was really driving the vegetation more than atmospheric conditions. But we were able to apply some technology to this project. Again, the beauty of having resources available through Lakeside Lab and students that were seeking training on these tools. We've got an aerial vehicle, we've got a drone, if you will, to be able to capture aerial imagery and see how this vegetation was establishing over time. And you can see again the path of the erosion control mat, as well as the drainage that was making its way once those tiles again were plugged. You have the second drainage ditch to the north that was also plugged, but the predominant increase in surface hydrology and soil saturation was happening in this southern area. And again, that green swath you see here is the sedge mat that was taken out of the drainage ditch that again basically followed that path where you see the flow of water moving and where the erosion control practices were put into place. A month goes by, again, we're in a drought. So you don't see a lot of heavy encroachment of a lot of vegetation, but we do see the soil starting to appear a bit darker. And we're starting to see also within these areas when we were walking on the site, vegetation coming back in as the soils were rehydrating. And it wasn't just reed canary grass and brome. It was rushes and sedges and species that we were hoping would return. By August, the erosion control blankets were actually starting to fill with plants that were thriving in the areas of saturation, which is great to see. And we do see, again, these being dominant species in this particular area, not just cool season non-natives. And by August of 2020, in August of 2020, we did see sedges and rushes starting to pop up. By 2021, we saw a lot more of them, or much more abundant, but we don't see a lot of fen indicators yet. So the species that John was mentioning, the Lobelia culmii, the Grassa parnassus, they're not necessarily present in this reconstructed area, but we're setting the stage for what could be an ideal place to hopefully see them. And I jotted down in my notes some of the comments that were made with the hooded ladies tresses by Crotty and Walden, where they said it was near a hillside spring where there was tufa present. Well, something tells me that area where we're seeing that increase in surface runoff and drainage, the area where we're starting to pond water again. I'm not a gambler, but if I were a betting person, I bet you that is the spot. I really hope that's the spot that they found those species. And hopefully when we return, as time passes, we can find them as well. Because again, we're seeing them return. We're seeing the rushes and the sedges return at a pretty rapid rate, given the fact that again, we've been dealing with a drought for the last 2 seasons. And this area was scraped off like the surface of the moon. So they've had a bare set stage to be able to reestablish. And some of the drainage path has included, it jumped a little bit once the erosion control map was put in place. But again, we have enough vegetation established that I feel confident that as this area fills in with what we're seeing as native vegetation, that we're able to keep most of that major erosion at a minimum. So the summer research and inquiry course that we had through Lakeside Lab included a couple of field-based studies at the Fen itself. There was a young woman who had recently graduated with a biology degree at University of Iowa who tried her hand at floristic and diversity, floristic diversity and quality assessment, excuse me, to be able to compare the species present in the remnant portion of the Fen with the area being reestablished. And again, she began her project when there wasn't a lot of vegetation out there. By August, she was back in Iowa City starting grad school. And that was really when we started to see the changes occur. Unfortunately, was after she left. I'd love to be able to get her out here this summer and this next summer and see what she thinks. But we also had a rising sophomore at Iowa State with a soil moisture and rehydration project that really provides evidence of what's happening and where it's happening in terms of the tile being broken in that study. And then we had the ongoing site documentation, whether it was just locating different GPS points for research purposes, but also aerial imagery, being able to incorporate LIDAR and other GIS maps to just grow our data set for this particular site. We were able to do some pretty cool stuff, I think. So to give you an idea of what came out of the soil rehydration study, Ashley had 49 locations that she was sampling weekly to be able to do gravimetric analysis to see over time where were degrees of saturation occurring, comparatively. And we were able to see, again, as you would expect, that area near that sedge mat is where we were seeing the greatest amount of rehydration over the course of the summer, again, in comparison to the percentage of saturation that we see in the remnant portion. We've got a ways to go yet, but again, I'm hoping we can repeat this study next summer and over time to be able to again, grow a data set. We have the aerial surveillance that David Hebring, he's actually, I believe David's going to be returning. I hope, my fingers are crossed right now, saying that he's able to return to do some aerial image capture for us as well. He was the one out at least once a month being able to get us aerial imagery and then stitching that information together. So we have it not only as video, but also still imagery that we can see a bit higher resolution than what we get from our publicly available data. Plus, it just gives us a different element to the dimension of the site, right? So what you see in the top is, looking at that sedge mat, moving our way toward it from the south, and this at the bottom is coming back toward that sedge mat from the north. So being able to use this imagery to not only conduct research, but tell a broader story of the site, of the project, of the, and share that with the stakeholders who are involved and make so they can make use of it is really what we hope the work we're doing can serve as far as a contribution. So what we've been able to see is, hydrologic change over time. It's already happening. Vegetation reestablishment, yep, check that box too. That's already happening. We do see annual weed encroachment. That's come up almost every time we've been out there. And the response is, we were expecting to see that. And as the site does saturate, more than likely we'll see some of that drop off. But the fact that we have such an abundant native population already taking hold, to me is a very positive sign. But we had not only students involved out at the site, but Lakeside Lab also has, if you're in Northwest Iowa and want to get involved with us, on Tuesdays each week, there's a group called Coffee and Grounds, and most of the time they do work on the Lakeside Lab campus, whether it's, seed harvesting, garlic mustard, things outside that people want to get involved with. we were able to visit this site as well as Fen Valley near Gillette Grove to give these volunteers an experience and use that as an opportunity for learning. We collected seed from the remnant portion of the fen and then scattered that seed on areas that still lack vegetation, again, in the hopes that we can grow that native population in the reestablished area. We're doing some water quality monitoring as well, just to be able to see, and again, just to get a baseline assessment of what's there and if things do change over time. And giving the volunteers also an opportunity to try out some of the equipment and learn some new technical skills themselves. So it's been a great opportunity to not only get students involved as well as members of the community at large too. So moving forward, if we're able to keep collecting data out here, and as long as I'm involved, I guarantee we're going to do that. And being able to also assist with management. It's a very weird year, again, in many ways, for things like cool season grasses. We're hoping to take advantage of resources that we have at Lakeside and help manage for some of the non-native species. If we need to do some herbicide applications, we've got folks available on hand to do that. Again, collecting data as this project moves forward. To be able to share that information and offer it as an opportunity for learning for young people and for future research projects as well. Just to give you an idea of what that point cloud looks like that we scanned about 2 years ago, it just looks kind of like it's the strangest looking ultrasound you've ever seen. But what we're going to focus on with this project is that drainage ditch and see if we can actually get a high resolution image of that area. And then again, compare that to other imagery. Since we didn't have a drone when we did this. We now have a drone. I'm hoping we can get some other fun remote sensing tools to be able to look at this area and see how the dynamics of the surface have changed over time, as well as looking at the vegetation. So it's just adding a different dimension to the kinds of data you can collect from a restoration site. So with that, I have the utmost gratitude to the Marine Apple family for allowing us to spend time on this site. It always gave me a lot of joy to hear when students would come back and they'd say, oh yeah, the folks that live up the road, yeah, the family members would come down and ask what they're doing, and they'd show them and involve them in some cases with some of the work they were doing, which was fantastic. NRCS and DNR have been tremendous partners. We wouldn't be able to do any of this work without them, as well as support from organizations like Iowa Native Plant Society. We're partnering right now with the GeoTree Center. It's a spatial science and technology lab at the University of Northern Iowa to be able to do some, play around with that point cloud data and a few other things. And thanks to the interns of the past 2 years, and hopefully we've got more to come. So with that, we've got contact information. You've got our emails here, and I think I will end my portion and I guess open things up for discussion of what's coming out of the chat.
Great, thank you so much. Gosh, that was a lot of information for us all to digest. And if anyone has to, get off, I understand it's late in the evening, so feel free to jump off, that's fine. But we do have a few questions for you all. And Rebecca, you just touched on this a little bit, but I am also curious, what were the reactions of the farm, the neighbors, and the other folks nearby in regards to what you guys were doing?
As far as what we were doing, it was mostly just curiosity. And then, because it was actually, I think, the son of the initial landowner. And so their reaction was more, curiosity. So what are you doing down here? And then it became, oh, well, the students are back. And then they would kind of, it definitely became very socially accepted to see that we had, they'd see the vehicle. We have a university vehicle that would show up. It looked pretty official. So I think that they enjoyed when they were flying the drone, being able to see tools and toys like that in action is always a good time. So it was a very positive experience.
And would you say, and maybe the Johns or John Polon can touch on this, like with construction and everything, did that, any red flags, or did anyone, raise
No,
bat
we
an eye
didn't.
to that?
No, our field staff did a really fantastic job of kind of bringing neighboring landowners up to speed prior to starting restoration. I will say that Clint Hain out of the Spirit Lake office had a good working relationship with the landowners to the west and to the north. And the main questions there, as I touched on earlier, were if there was any drainage tile that needed to be continued to maintain continuity of drainage of that farmland to the west in particular, that we would maintain that. And fortunately, all of the tiles that were present there drained, I believe, to the north and not to the Nepal property. So the only tiles we had to deal with on the Nepal property were within the confines of the easement, and so we could completely disable those systems and not impact any of the adjacent landowners.
Awesome. Okay, we also had several questions about the floristic quality index and how that was calculated, or did that involve transects, or I think John Pearson, that goes to you.
Yeah, I can speak to that. The one question about what does that adjusted floristic quality mean? I don't know. That's just a standard metric that shows up if you use the Conservation Divine Forms little computer program that pops up as one of the outcomes. And that was not on, Jerry Wilhelm, the author of the index, helped to program that the little app, but I don't recognize it from anything Jerry's ever written before, and I keep meaning to ask him sometime what exactly is the adjusted FQI. So I guess I wouldn't worry about that for now. Where everything's based on that, everything was that informed this project was just a standard FQI, and the adjusted is kind of a mystery to us all still. Yeah, and in terms of on this FQI, which is just based on just a whole stand releve approach, just to making a big list of what's there. It wasn't transects at this time, at least not as getting the project started. It was just an overall overview of what was present.
Great, thank you. Was stripping the reed canary grass successful in controlling or eliminating the grass?
Yeah, I'd say it's a mixed bag. The area that was stripped, trying to remove the big patch of canary grass between the two drainage ditches and used as fill, probably went down a few. I think it scraped off somewhere between 2 and 4 feet. If John can correct me if I'm wrong, but the canary grass roots can go deeper than that. So I think we're seeing some resprouting of the canary grass, and because their roots are deeper than the stripping effort. There's also a lot of this kind of old field species coming in right now. It's just kind of a dense kind of mishmash right now. It hasn't sorted itself out successionally. So smartweed and foxtail, it's just a mishmash of things at the moment. It's definitely not high quality fen. We can truly admit that, but we're happy to see the progress we have made down in the wetter parts, and we're just going to see what we can do at some point in the future with the rest of it. Thank you.
And what species of carex and rushes were coming up? I don't know if immediately is the right word, but
let me just point out, that the site's only had one full growing season. There was 2021. We had about the project. The bulldozers left the scene in August of 2020, and so we only had a few weeks of droughty fall. So it basically went into when the winter bare. And so we didn't see any action happening until 221, and even then it wasn't until the latter part of the growing season. Things just had to get started. In terms of sedges, I tried to inventory what sedges were there with various, a couple of walkthroughs. I haven't spent a lot of time there yet. And all I can say, it's young, sterile sedges at this point. It just is that there wasn't enough material to identify this species. Some of the other species, the bulrushes, they actually did. They're easier to identify and actually flowered this year. We've got Scirpus americanus, the three square, and then some of the more common species: soft stem bulrush, Scirpus validus, green bulrush, Scirpus etrovirens, Juncus torreyi, the Tory rush is very common on the site now. But there's a lot of Eleocharis, a lot of spiked rushes that were simply not, and small sedges that simply were not in an identifiable condition this year. So that's going to be, wait till next year to try to answer that question.
Great. Well, we have a ton of questions coming in, so I'm not going to be able to get to every single one of them. Sorry, guys. But I am curious, are you guys thinking about long-term and the potential, for lack of better words, of like contamination from adjacent land coming into the fen? Are you hoping to expand the protection around that?
Well, at a conceptual level, yeah. I mean, we're certainly well aware. It's a the remnant doesn't stop at the fence. We have uncontrolled land beyond it. It's ag land. That would be nice to add to the project. The fen itself, the NEPO property only captures about the bottom third. The southernmost third was originally the fen. The hillside extends another right up to a gravel pit. By almost a mile away. And so it's yeah, we're certainly aware of all those potentials, and it's all kind of at the dream stage at this moment, and I guess we don't have any concrete plans other than we're well aware of the importance of doing that over the long term.
The thing I would add to that, Sarah, would be that, like John just mentioned, probably a biggest concern to us that potentially throws a wrench in the works is that there is a very active sand and gravel mining operation immediately upstream to the north. And I was also told that the property just to the west has an option on it for similar sand and gravel mining. And my biggest fear in that situation would be that would further interrupt the hydrology that we've been working to restore. And that, again, could throw a wrench in the works of where we're at right now. It's just these fen systems and the flow of groundwater is there's a lot of stuff going on underneath there to understand and put together. And all those pieces of the puzzle, if one of those is missing, then what does that yield for our site? So I'm a little bit concerned about those adjacent land uses, but we're kind of at the mercy of the adjacent landowners in that regard.
Sure. So it's a comment/question. The sedge peat is surely gone and the compacted organic soil is less able to hold moisture. Was there any thought to incorporating organic residue to replace moisture holding properties to the restored area?
Well, I'd say in a general way, but I go back to John's caution that, the first caution is do no harm. So we tried to approach this very conservatively and try and let the natural features that are there kind of express themselves first before we started doing a lot of man-made manipulations, even well-intentioned man-made manipulations. We wanted to just hold off, give the system a chance to express itself, see how good or not good it performed over the first couple of years, and then reassess and see if something else needs to be done. So we're in that early stage right now of kind of waiting and seeing. We only had one full growing season. So if we're early into this, folks, this is probably going to take 100 years. We're 1% of the way into that project.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of vegetation overall, was it 100% utilizing that historic seed bank to reestablish, or did you do some seeding?
We did a couple of small things. One, mostly what you're seeing on the site and that swale today is a result of just natural colonization. The bulrushes and the juncus have all volunteered on their own. They've shown, and thank goodness they showed up in spades. Initially, last fall, in fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021, I was actually kind of worried that we weren't going to have any competition for the thistle, the Canada thistle. But thank goodness it came on midsummer, and at least it looks like a wetland community today, even though it's a fairly generalist community at this point. As Rebecca mentioned, when the project was started, we noticed that there was down the bottom of the drainage ditch, ironically, there was a patch of a tussock sedge, Carex stricta, and a few other species as well. And the bottom of the drainage ditch, whether it was trying to reestablish itself, if you will. And we knew the drainage ditch had to be filled, and we didn't want to just bury some, native stuff. And so we actually, I asked if they would please pick that up at great effort, move it to the hilltop, fill in the ditch, and then hopefully that the hilltop would rehydrate as a result of all the restoration activity, and that all that sedge could kind of reroot in its new home. We're still waiting for that to happen. It's still there. It did get that sedge did get pretty dry the last 2 summers, starting to turn brown. However, this fall, it looks like, now the drought might be easing a bit. There might be some more opportunity for that soil at the higher levels to actually rehydrate. Also, Rebecca can correct me if I'm wrong here, but there was plans, at least, I don't know if it actually came out, that we did it. The plan was to to recruit a bunch of volunteers to actually go out into the remnant part of the fen, scoop up some of the native fen plants that had gone to seed, and just hand carry it back up, and scatter it on site. Yep. Were we able to make that happen,
yep,
Rebecca?
That's exactly what happened at one of the last slides I shared. And actually, we've got a few folks that are listening tonight who were part of that, which is kind of cool to note also that the volunteers from Lakeside's Coffee and Grounds were able to collect seed from the remnant portion of the fen and redistribute in areas where we still had bare soil. So yes. And they're with us tonight.
Right. So yeah, so the answer is yes, but it's mostly natural succession, however you want to view that, supplemented with some at this farm some fairly small but well-intentioned efforts to help inoculate it with native species.
Sure. Okay, final question. How does the Nepal family feel about all this work and effort? Anyone?
You probably know them better than anyone, John.
Yeah.
Well, I honestly have not had direct contact with Murray for a few months, but when I believe kind of we got into the meat of this in the summer months, I talked with John and Rebecca about putting together some reports and conveying, the message of what's being done and the introduction of all the contributions of Lakeside Labs to the project. And I believe that was very well received. Rebecca, you can add to that, I guess, as you see fit. But they've been very supportive of the efforts to date. We've been very careful to, respect the fact that this is private property. We've kept them informed at every step of the way. Let them know that there was going to be a fair amount of activity out there at certain times of the year, mainly revolving around coursework at Lakeside Labs and the regular monitoring by NRCS field staff in the area. So we've just tried to do our due diligence to keep them up to speed.
I also recall, back when the project was still just kind of a dream project several years ago, the easement actually came to life once and kind of died, and then came to life a second time and succeeded this time. But several years ago, in fact, it was right after the Cowton Fen tour, I had a call that the Nepal family was interested in considering an easement, and could I come up right away? And that was the afternoon of the morning Fen tour. So I drove from Fayette County to Emmett County nonstop just to make that happen. And I remember going around with several members of the Nepal family. I remember Julie was one of the younger, family members at the time, and spent a lot of time with her walking around, pointing out the calm lobelia and the beak thrush, and all the rare plants, and she was just completely taken in and just excited at the prospect that we might someday have more of the fan looking like that remnant did. So I know at least some of the family members are extremely on board with what we've been proposing.
And I also want to mention too, the importance of having the programs available through the NRCS and the conservation easements, because again, referencing my family's experience, 35 years ago, those options didn't exist. The fact that you've got the word protection in the language of what qualifies a piece of land for a conservation easement, the fact that Fens have their own category. 35 years ago, folks had to get very creative to figure out how to do essentially the right thing. And it's really terrific from my perspective and my own personal experience to know that these options are available to people, because it makes their role as a landowner that much easier, because the program's there. And so it gives them an option that again, several years ago, people didn't have. So it's really important to note that the options exist, and this type of thing can happen elsewhere.
Appreciate that, Rebecca. The one thing that we hang our hat on in the easement world is that, as many of you know, NRCS is involved in a lot of aspects of conservation, working lands, and now conservation easements as well. But we like to hang our hat on the fact that of all the conservation activities that NRCS partakes in, easement programs are the only ones that involve permanent conservation. So it's a legacy for those of us involved, and myself and Cinder Jensen, who's on here tonight, who's the easement program coordinator. We really take a lot of pride in the fact that that's a lasting legacy piece of conservation that will remain on the land long after we're gone.
Right. And I know, the world of conservation, the world of many wounds that people talk about, and the hope can get very bleak, and people tend to I don't know, think fairly negatively about the future of conservation in Iowa, but that piece is a huge success over the last 3 decades. So that alone to me is a major step forward in the right direction.
All right. Well, I feel like we could really go on and on with this, and I'm just so happy that people are still asking questions and they're still engaged. So
right.
And thank you for that glimmer of hope, Rebecca. And yeah, I absolutely agree. And I'm just super thankful for the easement program within NRCS. That's my jam. But yeah, and I just also am hoping that we can continue this conversation in the future. We can continue having updates and keeping everyone well informed in what's going on. And I appreciate you guys being willing to do that tonight. And again, thank you to everyone who stuck it out for the long haul, and for those that were able to jump on when they could. So with that, we will end it, and have a great evening.
Okay. A lot.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for
Thank you.